I am Lauren Mattern with Nygaard, and I'm going to be kind of running us through today's session, but really I'm so excited to hear from the two panelists, and I'm excited to ask them some questions. I'm excited for you all to ask them some questions. The topic today is around curb management, but specifically wanting to focus on what does it really mean to look at curb management holistically and to look at it with a people first lens. And that's not particularly easy to do. There is so much conversation around how to price the curb, what pilots to operate at the curb. So much is changing, so many new pressures. And what I want to do today and what we try to do and what we try to think about is about kind of the bigger picture, not just kind of the latest trend, the latest pressure, the latest crisis we need to react to at the curb, but really the backdrop against which everything's occurring, how we should really think about it as a multifaceted asset, and then how all of these different management tools and pressures and pilots come together under like a bigger lens. So there are so many amazing practitioners in the curb space, but I really specifically wanted to hear from Francesca and Joseph, who are on the line today. And that's because they are doers at the curb. They are people who have a lot of implementation pressure and experience in their day-to-day portfolio of what they're up to at the curb. And I think that they're forced to have these really big policy questions, these really big visions for what the curb can be, but really balanced with what does it mean to actually implement that? Like, how do you actually guide decisions? How do you implement these visions? What are the challenges to making this work on the sort of wild west of the curb? It's a rugged environment for all of the things that we're trying to get it to do. So it's a topic that I am personally really interested in and try to tackle a lot in my work. But when I'm talking to different cities about who's doing this well, I'm often touting what Francesca's done and what Joseph has done in San Francisco and Austin with their teams. And so I wanted to kind of share and highlight some of the ways that they've wrestled these challenges to the ground. So today we are going to just give a little initial framing, and then we're going to hear from Francesca and Joseph about the specific strategies in Francesca's case and roadmap in Joseph's case of how they are making sense of what to do at the curb and how to fit all of these different competing priorities together and make things have an implementation lens at the end. I have a few questions for them, all of the burning questions that I'm always wrestling with in my work, working on curb projects for different cities. And then I also am really curious to hear from the audience. So throughout this whole session, just drop your notes into the chat box. We are going to have at least 20 minutes at the end to answer your questions. And I would encourage you to think about what questions you would want to hear answers from implementers in the field who wrestle with how to make some of these big ideas that we all talk about reality in the field. So our speakers today are Francesca Napolitan from the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. She is currently the curb access manager. So she oversees corridor and neighborhood curb management plans. She has some background in parking management, but has been part of the transition to formalizing that everything is all about curb management, not just parking management. The specific piece of work that has really stood out for me from her team's work over the last few years is their curb management strategy. She's going to talk about that, but it provided a roadmap for how to allocate limited space. And when I think about all of the curb strategies out there, it stands out to me as one that is, it has lots of vision. It's really values focused, but it's just extremely practical. which I appreciate. So I'm excited to hear more about that from Francesca. And she's been a consultant in the past in parking management, TDM background, and so just brings kind of this multimodal lens to her work. And then our second speaker is going to be Joseph Al-Hajeri here from the Austin Transportation Department, just down the road from me. And Joseph is his newest title is the Mobility Demand Program Manager for Austin Transportation Department. I think that just changed a couple weeks ago. And he has a background in parking management and implementation, and kind of is somebody who has just this wealth of implementation experience, gets a lot of projects implemented quickly around town. Here in Austin, a lot of things are changing with mode split goals, and he's risen to the challenge with his whole team to figure out how parking and curb fits into that picture. So he currently oversees a portfolio of parking and shared mobility projects and assets. So not just the policy work, but the implementation work, and is really charged with running a holistic and very future-looking lens to their curb management projects. I absolutely love how action-oriented his practice is. He's always looking to really get things done, not just talk about it forever. And so he moves quickly, his whole team moves quickly, but also really grounded in vision and the bigger picture. Those of you who have been to Austin also know that there's a pretty robust, or at least pre-COVID, a pretty robust micromobility market that very much fits into his charge of thinking about the curb and creating an abundant mobility environment. And so you can ask Joseph any kind of question about what it means to change payment methods, rethink enforcement. How do you wedge in micromobility policy into your mobility ecosystem to support mode split goals? These are topics that he's really passionate about. I'm going to move forward here. I'm just going to give a little bit of background on why I care about this topic so much and why we're taking this specific angle with the group today. So I think everyone here has heard a lot about curb management probably at this conference and over the last 2 years. We all know that the curb is getting a ton of attention. We're all familiar with the increased pressures coming from every angle. We've seen the plethora of TNC pilots, delivery pilots, discussions about pricing the curb, and of course, all of that just reinforcing how important it is to get that right. But we also want to zoom out and think about the role of the curb in much more broadly than the latest pressure. We want to think about what our broader community goals are, shifting transportation mode shares, improving access for all constituents, thinking about what curb equity really looks like. The curb is more than just kind of the latest, pressure showing up on the street that we need to make space for. It's more than just the monetary value and pricing pilots that we're all trying to work through. It has so many different roles. And so when we think about holistic and people-first curbs, we're challenging ourselves to zoom out and think about all of these different goals. And that's, quite frankly, a big challenge, and one that these folks have some experience wrestling with. And I think it's really important for me to always reinforce that although there's so much happening and we're talking about future mobility devices and reacting to what we're seeing on the streets and trying to shoehorn it in, make it work better, none of this is happening on a blank slate. We're doing this on a backdrop where we've had a lot of policies and management tools that have already shaped how curbs are allocated. And we have to kind of look a little further back in history to make sure that we're managing our curbs well if we want it to match our goals. A big theme that jumps out to me when I think about the curb is how much do you want to be reactive versus proactive. There's plenty of good pilots out there that are noting that a certain use case at the street is going bananas, need to better allocate and arrange space for things like TNCs and things like the newest delivery devices. And that's real. I mean, we need our streets to be safe and work well. But if we just keep reacting to the latest mode, quite frankly, we're not going to get very far. We have to bring all of our mode split goals and practices, past and present, up for investigation if we want to think about curb management more holistically. The innovation and technology piece can't be, it's incredibly important, but we can't look at it as if it's happening out of nowhere. We have biases built into our curb for decades. And so if we don't look at those biases while we think about what's to come, we're really, quite frankly, going to miss the bigger picture. I know a lot of us are also struggling with getting better data at the curb to help justify these decisions and help guide us on questions around how to change our policy mechanisms, how much is the curb worth, how much to price. So there certainly are some data and technology aspects to this, but hopefully always rooted in our bigger goals that we talked about. And this illustration here, these mode split numbers are actually pulled from downtown Atlanta, but the story is pretty consistent across most of the cities probably represented on the call today. We all have, or not all of us, but a lot of our cities have, pretty aggressive mode split goals. Joseph will talk about theirs, and they're really gunning for it. They are taking Austin's mode split goals in the strategic mobility plan really seriously. But if you compare that to how the curve is divided today, it's absolutely not parsed in a way that gets us to our mode split goals at all. Most of our curb space is used for modes with really low person throughput, really low efficiency, just poor accessibility for most users of the curb. So we're often trying to look at that disconnect, right, between how curbs are allocated today and what our actual goals are and how we want to get there. So these goal figures are pulled from the Atlanta Transportation Master Plan. But if we start to think about what equitable access to our curbs look like, it looks pretty different from how we manage our curbs today. And we keep managing kind of mode by mode without thinking about that balance and how we need to reallocate space aggressively. We are going to miss this window of opportunity to think about curb management and curb technology in a way that truly kind of matches those initial goals we went over. So I'm excited to turn it over now. We're going to hear from Francesca and then Joseph, two really, really different approaches to getting organized on how to manage the curb. And I think that the attendees on the call today are going to probably identify with one or the other in terms of like how they're catching up to implementing their values at the curb, how to articulate those and how to act on them. So I'm excited for you to kind of compare and contrast how two very different cities are taking this challenge very head on. So I'll hand it over to you, Francesca.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm happy to be here today to talk more about my agency's curb management strategy, which we adopted in February of last year. So I think like many other cities over the past 10 years, we've really seen an emergence of new transportation modes and users that are competing for curb space, like TNCs, bike sharing, and scooters. At the same time, we've also seen a large uptick in deliveries due to the growth in online shopping and on-demand deliveries, which has only intensified in the pandemic. While at the same time, our agency really still has core users like our muni bus service, paratransit, and taxis that we need to serve, all of which is putting increased pressure on the limited curb space that we have. So this increased demand for curb access in combination with a lack of adequate loading space has resulted in safety hazards such as crosswalks and bike lanes being blocked. It's impacted accessibility negatively, and it's also increased transit delay. So predominantly the SFMTA has relied on our color curb program, which is a request-based system to allocate curb space to different users. And as you can see from the graphic on the screen, this really has resulted in this mismatch that Lauren had started talking about in how we allocate curb space versus how people are really getting around. And as you can see from this graphic, in the city of San Francisco, we've allocated roughly 90% of our curb to storage for vehicles, while we've only allocated 1% for active uses such as mini bus stops, passenger loading zones, paratransit, and bike share, which really is out of alignment with our larger goals. So the curb management strategy at a high level proposes a new approach and rethinking of the curb to shift away from car parking to a more holistic approach that looks at the needs of a neighborhood or corridor as a whole and allocates curb space in a way that reflects our changing transportation landscape to better meet both our current as well as our future transportation and delivery needs. It's also designed to support our wider goals, such as our Vision Zero and Transit First policies and our climate action strategy mode split goals, as well as improving equity and accessibility, supporting business vitality, and increasing transparency with the public in how we do our planning processes. So the curb management strategy has three main components. The first is the curb hierarchy, which prioritizes curb functions by land use. Then we developed a set of recommended strategies. And then lastly, we have a set of design guidelines, which provide guidance to planners, engineers, and project managers about how to lay out the curb, things like dimensions and placement of different curb typologies. But today I'll just be focusing on our curb hierarchy. So for us, the first step in creating our curb hierarchy was identifying who uses the curb and what the key functions of the curb are. So we developed 5 key curb functions. And the first is access for people. This is our most active space that moves people to and from the curb and includes things like our bus stops, taxi stands, bike share, paratransit, and passenger loading. The second is access for goods, which is space for deliveries, both traditional as well as new models such as on-demand deliveries. Then we have public space and services, which for us includes things like our parklet program. Then we have storage for vehicles, which includes private auto parking, reserved parking for specific users and driveways. And then lastly, we have movement, which is when we use the curb lane for through movement of either motorized or non-motorized modes of transportation. So for us, this is things like curbside running bus lanes or bike lanes or peak tollway lanes. So the second step in creating our hierarchy was to think about how adjacent land uses affect the way in which the curb is used and how these needs vary throughout the city. So we identified 6 typologies. The first is low density residential. So this are single family home neighborhoods. Then we have mid to high density residential, which are multifamily housing with locally serving retail. So things for the neighborhood like corner coffee shops, laundromats, corner stores. Then we have neighborhood commercial, which is a mix of residential and commercial and attracts people from other parts of the city or throughout the region as a whole. Then we have our downtown, which is our most dense and active part of the city and has a mix of retail, residential, and office. Then we have major attractors, which are land uses with specific needs that may be temporal or seasonal, things like stadiums, hospitals, schools, and tourist attractions. And then lastly, we have our industrial PDR designation. So taking the curb functions and the land use typologies we identified, we created a prioritization matrix to help guide how we allocate our curb space in projects. So the purpose of the hierarchy is not to exclude anyone, but to first allocate what curb space we have to those highest priority functions to make sure those needs are met first. And in fact, because the higher priority functions tend to be more space efficient, there often is still remaining space for parking, which is a concern that we hear a lot. And the application of this, even if 2 neighborhoods were in the same typology, it really needs to reflect the needs of those specific neighborhoods. So, you know, going through this, what you would actually see play out in the curb is very different because we need to take into account the needs of two different neighborhoods. So it can really be tailored specific to the specific needs of a neighborhood, even though, you know, you have this typology. It's really just guiding how you allocate curb space, but the proportions will be relative to what the needs of that actual community are. And then I think kind of the key thing is you can really see this shifts away from this prioritization of auto parking, which has been kind of our historical way of allocating curb space, and really makes clear to the public that we're realigning how we use our curb to actually meet our values and the goals that we want to achieve. All right, and I will turn it over now to Joseph from Austin.
Thank you, Francesca. Yeah, that was awesome. I really appreciate all of that. That was, you know, really informative and great work. And yeah, the city of Austin has done similar things, but we've taken a very quick approach to implementation due to some of the issues we have with, you know, really rapid growth in Austin with not enough multimodal options. And so taking over Austin's growth has really impacted our mobility system, including parking, where we see that, you know, our price of parking and the way that our curbs are interacted with are so confusing and so cheap that it incentivizes people to use their vehicles, which then in turn creates conflict at our curb space where people fight for that space. You can go to the next slide. So what is the, you know, the role of the curb today, and, you know, how did we identify in Austin before we started really looking at some of these changes that we need to occur? We really needed to see what the issues were on the ground level. We know that, you know, every community has different needs, especially when it comes to transit and parking, but we wanted to pull out some of the major consistent items that we've seen that cause the most conflict. So one of the biggest issues that, of course, like Francesca said, most of our system typically is dominated by, you know, car storage and left there from time to time. And that really causes issues for people that, you know, are, you know, most value is, you know, the most valuable time for them is, you know, getting in and out in the most convenient way. And, you know, a lot of the issues that we've seen are at odds with our current goals, you know, with safety, equity, and mobility. Kind of what Lauren had mentioned with the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan, which is, I'll mention here in a second, you know, had hefty goals, and none of our, you know, parking management system at the time was equipped or adequate enough to meet those demands. And then, of course, we know that parking and the way we currently did things in Austin was subsidizing those that could afford parking. So then those that needed to get in and out and their time is most valuable to them could not, and which, you know, is very inequitable and not flexible in our space to allow people to get in and out. I will say that, you know, we have other indicators here. I have multiple slides with this, so I'll just kind of point them out because I don't have the red arrows to them, but you obviously see there's issues with scooters on parking, which is, you know, we have a robust micromobility system here in Austin. And we also have signage and different signage causing more confusion. How long can I park? When can I park? And all these messages, while someone is trying to get in and out in the most convenient way, trying to read all these indicators, which causes just more conflict and more issues at our curb. So how did we tackle this, right? Well, over the, you know, past 6-7 years, we have put out many different, you know, supporting policies that have guided different curb management goals for the city. Our Austin downtown parking strategy outlined, you know, some of the major issues that we have with, you know, land development code, with our curb strategy, and with equity in order for us to, you know, kind of fix and right size our current parking system. And then, you know, Austin Strategic Mobility Plan is our first, you know, mobility plan in Austin in 25 years. It was a big, you know, effort, and there's a lot of specific moving parts in there that we've been actively working on. We update that every quarter to understand where we are and what's the next plan is to move some of these initiatives forward. And not to only mention Smart Mobility Roadmap, our climate plan, And of course, our city manager put out an also strategic direction focusing on mobility and equity. All these, plans and policies support and put out information about how we should manage our curbs. But, the real issue is how do we create, implementation in a way that allows us to push forward these hefty goals while really focusing on what the community needs at those curbs. Next slide. So from those, policy, we wanted to address, some, these 4 factors here and kind of redefine how we look at the curb space. Now, these are just major indicators. This is the way we pulled off from, those plans. And we wanted to ensure how do we, make, a set of goals to implement some of these new curb strategies from those plans. So one, we needed to redefine the role of the curb. We needed to understand, the needs of the community, how those curbs were being interacted with, and who was interacted with, and why. Understanding our current administration internally. How do our management structure work? How does implementation work? And how can we improve the way that we do things in order to, supply new policies and new projects that are going to impact our curb in the most equitable and expeditious way. And of course, addressing, access equity, right? We understand that it's important for our curbs to be flexible in order to address the need for all that are using the curb, not only just people that are parking or using their own vehicle, but those that don't have a vehicle that need to use other, transportation methods to move around. And imagining evolving functions. The city of Austin is extremely dynamic. We have, many festivals of a year, pre-COVID, of course, that, are consecutive. We have South by Southwest, we have Austin City Limits Festival, which are 2 major attractions, and then multiple other, smaller events throughout the year. In the past, we've never had a curb, management plan or, roadmap or anything that, defines the way that we look at the curb. Although those were the major conflicts that we had moving through events and other issues in Austin. So this first part of understanding what our challenges and opportunities were was the first step in lining up how we look at a curb roadmap for the city of Austin, the first one. So this is what we came up with the focus on equity first. That's important. Understanding what our community needs and how those curbs are going to be used and interacted with is key to understanding these next 4 indicators. Mode shift support. Understanding what tools we need to provide to give the communities those the support they need to reach those goals or to reach the major goals. Reducing carbon emissions, of course, is a huge goal for us in Austin. We want to ensure that our environment and the people that are living in our space are able to do so in a healthy manner. User-friendly, adaptable, or both go hand in hand. We want to ensure that we make a system that is easy to understand, less confusing, so that interaction with the curb is seamless and adaptable. Of course, we understand that things like COVID could affect our system, and we need to be able to put things in place quickly in order to give the communities things they need to survive. Let me just get some water. So how do we make this connection with our current goals and our strategies? This is kind of an outline of how we took our approach. We have our indicators, and then we create these 3 buckets: foundations, operation, and policy, user experience and transparency, and innovation and testing. And we started looking at our different goals that we've had through our different policies, as well as internal goals, in order to reach an efficient system, or at least in a system that we're able to adapt. And these indicators allowed us to really, start diving into implementation. So percent drive, and I, kind of give some background here. ACC is the Austin, or the American Cities Climate Challenge with Bloomberg. Austin was a part of it. And so we had some hefty targets with them. I won't talk too much about those because those are a longer conversation, but I'll look at these indicators: percent drive alone trips, parking occupancy, and percent space covered by new policies. The goal of our objectives and our strategy was to focus on not adding more paid parking spaces, but removing parking spaces or relocating parking spaces in a way that we are allowing those curb spaces to be used efficiently, aligning up our goals with the community needs to access that space, as well as our ultimate goals for mobility and reducing, single occupancy trims. Next slide. So here is how we took this approach. And a lot of these approaches have been implemented within a year's time frame. So that gives you some context on how much we did in the past year. So, pricing that reflects the demand of the curb, we need to ensure that we first right-size our system to reflect the current pricing of our curb. We hadn't, increased or changed our base rate for paid parking in over 2 decades. It was like something like that. So we took the plan to, use a way to increase that really quickly by asking the community, what's the next step for this? And so we looked at the cost variances and decided that $2 an hour was the right way to go, but we needed to ensure that we had the authority to flex those rates for future demand. So we were given a flex from $2 to $5. Going into progressive pricing, we needed that anytime someone parks, the longer that they stays there, the more of a impact they have on our mobility system. We wanted to ensure that there could be times where people can park. We have max time limits. We didn't want to, if someone needed to stay a little bit of time, we didn't want to prevent them from being able to use that space. So we created a progressive pricing system that charges you for the amount of time that you stay there, rather than maxing you out and then having to move your vehicle. Prioritizing curb needs, really focusing on what we hear from the community and implementing those things quickly and putting in key performance metrics to understand how those new curb uses are being used and how effective they are. Accessibility and equality. We really focus on, especially during the pandemic and before, we wanted to focus on less punitive actions, removing those things that create another situation for drivers that causes heartache. I mean, citations, even though you feel like you've parked right, can really have an impact on someone where they feel like they're taken advantage of, and it's not the best use of our system. We need to educate and make our messaging clear for the curb to ensure that someone's autonomy is not interrupted in a way that's going to impact their life. Affordable parking programs, we started to create a program that or a policy that anytime we implement any type of regulation that's going to impact someone financially in a way, that we needed to create another program that would offset that impact. So affordable parking program, we've partnered with over 30 to 40 garages to give $35 a month parking passes, as long as you can show proof that you work in the downtown area. And we've increased that from the first time we started it over 4 years ago, from 1 garage to 5 people, in the program, to now over 300. More options to pay. Google Maps. We were able to implement Google Maps into our system along with our mobile pay system, and we're always adding and finding ways to add options for people, even those most crucial to the system that need to use it, and those that are bankless. And clear messaging on signage, of course, is key to ensuring that our system is adaptable and clear and able to be used. Data and technology is extremely important, but like Lauren said, if we don't have these other indicators and these other important facts in place first, the data doesn't mean anything. We understand that data can represent something that we see by physical numbers, but doesn't really reflect people's lived experiences. So we take both of those into account. We want to become less physical and more digital. We removed all of our single space meters from the system, and only have pay stations or mobile pay only zones. And we're constantly educating people on how to use that. Block level zones gave us ability to change and adapt and bring a single point of reference for all data within single blocks, not just parking data, curb level data, but also traffic data and other data that's obtained for that block itself. Digitizing curb regulations, data dashboards, and data standards are important. And I will touch lastly on data standards, because it's important as we continue in the digital age that we find a way for parking vendors and other companies to create a standard that allows us to tie data together and not be able to, or not leave them in silos like they've been done in the past. This is just a couple of pictures of understanding where we are at in Austin. Internally, we've created dashboards to understand different key metrics and how we're using over time. matching those up with previous fiscal years, as well as occupancy, and using different methods to understand how we do that, including total number of parking spaces on the block, total minutes purchased, closures, and things like that to give us a number of what occupancy looks like. There is no metric out there currently that has been tested and proved that really sheds light on how we look at occupancy, because there's so many different variables in place. But we're working on that and finding different ways locally to find a method that works for Austin. And lastly, really quickly, this is kind of what the product looks like. I mean, after we've implemented, really quickly, we have a curb management, roadmap that prioritizes those without access to private vehicles. Parking becomes more intuitive, right? Because people know when they can and cannot park in a space, and it's clearly used. We're listening to the community and understanding their needs. Maybe it's not a parking space, maybe it's placemaking and place to sit and read. We really want to focus on clearing and making clarity of our rules and pricing, reducing the number of drivers circling for parking, but also, really incentivizing alternative modes for the future.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Francesca. So I hope you got a little bit of a flavor for kind of the process here. San Francisco had a lot of curb programs, a lot of policies on the books, a lot of different programs operating in isolation. And the strategy that Francesca referenced was like a pause to reassess and make sure that all of that was working together. And then you kind of contrast that with what Joseph's dealing with, and like a city that is just growing like crazy fast. And traditionally a single occupancy vehicle, sometimes I like to say SOT, single occupancy truck in Austin, just to show that we are starting even in a more difficult spot, but really aggressive mode split goals, a lot of need to reprioritize. And so he's sort of bringing his vision to bear quickly, but he needs to kind of catch up and establish some of the programs that need to get created quickly. So it's sort of two different cadences and approaches to get there, more or less rowing in the same direction, but at different points in kind of their curb management history. So I'm going to ask a couple of quick questions, but I want to leave time for audience members as well. I see one question coming in the chat, and also I'll be happy to kind of have people chime in too if they'd rather share their questions verbally. So get your questions together, and then I have a couple I really want to get to first. I think one of the really difficult things that I observe with different cities is around striking the balance between having a really comprehensive policy but moving fast enough. I think there's so much pressure to develop a quick pilot or to react quickly to the latest pressure, the latest sort of mode showing up on our streets. But that kind of comprehensive policy lens is often not moving at the same pace. So I wanted to ask each of you how you strike that balance between having like a great comprehensive opinion and policy and point of view for how to make these decisions, but knowing that things are coming at you pretty quickly and that you want to remain, nimble too to what's hitting. Any thoughts on that?
Sure, I can start. So I think, like Lauren said, our city kind of got to this point where we needed to take a pause. For better or worse, San Francisco was where a lot of these new services have first emerged and as they were developed here. And so we were one of the first cities to start seeing all of these new things on our streets, like electric scooters, food delivery robots, you name it, like we've seen it here. And so I think as an agency, we were just stuck in this bad cycle of being reactive instead of proactive. And when you're rushed to make decisions, you can get outcomes that don't necessarily align with your values. And so we did take a pause and say, we need to take a step back and really articulate what our values are and how we're going to make decisions. And so that was one of the foundational goals of the curb management strategy, was to make it very clear to the public as a whole how we were going to allocate this limited resource and why. And it was really based in, this is a limited thing. We need to use it as efficiently as possible, which for us means moving people and goods and not necessarily prioritizing parking for cars, which had been our historic model. And also, you know, moving people and goods generally aligns with all of our city's objectives, like transit first, supporting businesses, our mode shift goals. So I think what has been interesting to see is now that we have this foundation in place, when these things come at us, we have a way to at least frame the decision making. It doesn't predict the outcome, but it gives us a foundation to say, yes, we will try this, or no, this doesn't actually fit with what our city values and we're not going to do this pilot. Or, you know, we will do this one because there's the potential that it could improve access. So I think at a high level, taking that pause and doing this enables us to move quicker, obviously within the limits of working in a government agency. There, you can only move so quickly, but I think it's provided us a foundation for decision making and also being clear with the public why we're making the decisions we're making.
Yeah, that's good points. And I think, you know, for the city of Austin, you know, like we said, 25 years without a, you know, strategic mobility plan, you know, nonetheless, you know, nothing really on curb management. We really had to kind of work coincidentally at the same time to get actions completed while we're doing something comprehensively. With me being in the parking business for the last 11 years, the one thing I do know is, you know, trying to do any kind of community engagement when it comes to parking and curb management, this is very tough. I mean, you usually get typically, no, 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 I don't want any of that. That doesn't even make sense. So because of that, and I remember as a planner first coming out and, you know, running the streets thinking I was going to get some great feedback and was told no. I think that really changed my perspective. And that perspective was, they want to, you know, people want to see results and they want to see things happen and they want to be able to see what those results yield so that they can, you know, really see the you know, the level of information that we're giving them is true, right? And so that's what we started doing, and that focus has really helped us, you know, taking bite-sized chunks, listening to the community of the things they need, allowing us to try those out in a very small portion, allowing the community to use the same tools that we use to be able to look at those and decide for themselves if it worked or not. And then using that feedback to then at that point implement at a larger scale. And we've done that, and we've seen great things. At the same time, we've had immense amount of pressure, you know, as you know, we grow, you know, really fast, to be able to implement things, you know, in a way that is going to yield results pretty fast. So, you know, some of those things is implementing some things really fastly and then getting feedback and adjusting, so that the community can really take that on. Sometimes it's, you know, giving out free parking. We've done 15-minute free parking, you know, validation codes since COVID started, and has gotten a lot of feedback, ensuring that people, you know, pay for what they, you know, actually park for, and making it efficient. A lot of these things are, you know, action items that you can implement really fast, and create tracking systems to be able to understand the success and then be able to display that to the public and allow them to use the same tools you used to be able to determine exactly what we determined to be able to implement something really quickly. So two different very, you know, strategies here. And don't get me wrong, I love San Francisco's way. Believe me, I'd take that and put it in place in Austin because it makes sense. You know, having something that's comprehensive in a way that really explains how you're going to use those curbs is invaluable to the community. We're just in two different places.
Mm-hmm. One more question from me, and then I want to get to some of the questions in the chat. I think often I notice in the sort of curb management world, we don't, you know, we talk a lot about kind of the latest pilot, we talk about pricing, we talk about new pressures, But I'm glad today we're kind of talking more about, how to ground all of that in actual policy goals and what that really looks like. But we also need to talk more about what internal structure, what support is actually needed to deliver on that kind of vision. I'm glad that future of the curb is getting a lot of attention, and it really deserves it. But I was curious if either of you had any thoughts on what it really takes to deliver on those visions. I think that's sometimes useful for the audience who may not be kind of in the implementation weeds every day, to have an appreciation for what it takes to get to those results.
Yeah, I can start. So to give you a quick analogy in the way I kind of look at this is that, being a curb management professional and someone that is working at the city level trying to implement things is similar to a wedding planner. You're trying to get everything, everybody kind of coordinated internally to get things completed. But the problem is everybody's working in their own project silos. And so what ends up happening is we don't communicate, and then other initiatives or similar like initiatives are being launched at the same time. This isn't only happening in your local public government, but also as well as your regional, local, and state partners. They're all implementing similar projects. So for us it was realigning some of those key aspects of curb management into one group, and focusing on those that interact with that, as well as creating new methods for us to communicate and put out newsletters to different divisions and departments so they understood where we were at, so they can communicate with us. We in Austin had a disjointed parking management system where our parking enterprise didn't even have control over off-street parking. That was completely separate. And we've made changes to align those things together so that we can make changes that are fluid and consistent with what we're doing on street. And so the messaging is consistent on off street. And so it's working together, removing those silos, that is important in order to create a structure internally that's going to be important for you to implement things in a shorter amount of time that are more efficient, but the same quality as something that's been done 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just echo what Joseph said, in that we struggled also with these silos and different groups not talking to each other. And our view was actually that the curb management strategy and the curb management team itself was the tool to break those silos, because every project has a curb component, and the curb is critical to the success of a transit project, a bike project. And so we really saw our team and this work as supporting all of the work that our agency does, because we do operate a transit system as well. And so as part of developing it, we actually really focused on in-reach, and we met with all the teams across the agency whose work touches the curb. We did focus groups with them about what was working for them, what wasn't, what policy changes they need, both within legislation as well as just internal structure, workflow processes, like what was broken, what wasn't working. And so that helped frame all of the recommendations that we have in the strategy. So those came out of these focus groups with folks across our agency, as well as at our sister agencies like the planning department and public works, who also touch the curb as well. And so through that in-reach, people began to be aware of our team and what we did, and started to see the value in curb management and how having a successful curb could support their work. And so now we're kind of this team that really serves as a consultant to the rest of the agency. We get put on other teams' projects. I work on transit projects, I work on bike projects, as well as just solely curb focused projects, looking at how the curb can make those projects successful. We are also like technical advisors. Other teams will send us questions about their projects and we'll answer them for them. So I think for us, kind of this internal consensus building kind of acknowledgement of the role of the curb was also a huge goal of this, versus it just being like a public facing document.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate how important that is and what a big shift that is. Breaking down some of those silos and getting people to trust each other's data and expertise in a sort of big city department environment like that. It's a subtle thing, but it's actually a huge innovation and a huge leap of trust. So those little things really, really matter. And it's an immense amount of work that's not the type of thing you see in like the flashy press release or the flashy plan, but all that behind the scenes trust building and ironing out all of the pipes and getting people talking. It's a huge lift. So just want to underscore that. We have some questions in the chat. Peter from Portland, who's a curb management person in his own right, is asking about your curb plans and if they have any measures of success that you're tracking.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so preliminary, I mean, of course, with implementation, that's pretty quickly done. You know, we want to make sure that we have ways to track these systems. Of course, like I mentioned before, we've created individual zones for every single block in our city, you know, that allows us to connect all data points to it. And so when we're doing a project, you know, that is testing a commercial zone or looking at how we allocate different curb uses at the same curb space, we would put, you know, indicators, you know, either sensors or something in place, cameras. We're also starting to use drones and other things to be able to track these different successes. And, you know, if they're hitting those marks, then we would, you know, show those in a report that allows us to give, gain feedback from the community on it. And then we implement it. For an example, we tested out a binary system for using our street system. So basically, either there's only two types of really curb uses in that sense, and that is, you know, someone that is, you know, something that is being used for a service type of space, you know, or something that is for parking or vehicle storage. And if we were going to put a regulation in place, then, you know, it needed to ensure that if it switched to something like, say, it's valet parking or pay parking and valet parking at night, we want to ensure the same type of usage were put together. So commercial zone during the day turns into valet zones at night. Paid parking stays paid parking to ensure that those things, you know, stay together. So then we would track those, right, through surveys and things that would allow us to see how those changes are being reported on the street.
And for us, we have kind of a range depending on the type of project. So, you know, if it's curb management along a corridor where we're putting in a dedicated bike facility, then one of the key things that we measure in before and after data is near misses, because one of the key, you know, things we're looking to is improve safety for cyclists. On a transit corridor, we would be measuring transit delay before and after as an indicator of success. In areas where, you know, we're looking at reconfiguring loading, we often use cameras to see, you know, is there double parking due to lack of loading space? Is, you know, the loading zone being abused by someone who's just sitting there for hours? And, you know, what we would then look at in the after data is, you know, is there better utilization of those zones in the way that we would hope they'd be used? Do we see less double parking because we've provided more loading space to meet demand? So those are some of the metrics that we look at depending on, you know, kind of what was the intention of the project.
Great, thank you. Our Austrian friend is asking about your issues with double parking, especially around deliveries. I'm guessing maybe that could be traditional freight deliveries and also maybe some of the newer delivery models that are using personal vehicles or smaller vehicles. So just generally, how do you have issues with double parking? How did that fit in to your curb management approach?
Sure, we have huge issues with double parking, both from just kind of a cultural perspective that people are like, it's no big deal, I'm just going to be here for 5 minutes, versus a more systemic problem where, like you saw from my slide, we've dedicated 1% of our curb for access for goods, which clearly does not align with the need. And so, you know, in our strategy, we have a number of recommendations specifically around this issue that approach it from different angles. And the first angle is you can't really expect compliance when you don't provide the curb space that people need. And so, some of our strategies are around, the need for more commercial loading, also the need for a loading zone typology that people in personal vehicles delivering goods can use, because in our city, commercial loading zones can only be used by people who have commercial plates, which leaves out a whole portion of the delivery market and doesn't provide them a safe space to pull to the curb. So we also have abuse of different types of zones. And so we've made recommendations around that. I also think there's the education side of it, which, can be difficult in trying to figure out how to best reach people, but better trying to convey that there are real consequences to this behavior. It may only be 5 minutes to you, but the culmination of 50 people only double parking for 5 minutes does really have a negative impact on our system. So this is definitely something we've struggled with, and we have a range of recommendations that we created to approach this issue from different angles.
Awesome. I know we're short on time, so I'll make it quick. Yeah, so this, we've had the same issues, of course, with deliveries, and double parking, is no, I think, difference between any other city that has the same issues. The way we took it upon ourselves is that we understand that, commercial vehicles need to get in and out of downtown really quickly. The longer they stay there, the more of an environmental impact they have on congestion and a lot of other things that are going on. So I think what we did is we put in a permit system in place that allowed double parking to occur on streets that have 2 lanes or more going in one direction at certain times of the day, and then not allowing double parking on other times of the day on peak arterial roads. And then we have different, levels of that, of course, but we also needed to ensure that we increased the citations amount, because a lot of the companies were then rebilling their customers at the price of getting citations. So then they would double park and there was no consequence to it. So now without the permits, we went from a $30 or $40 double parking ticket to now $250, which really prevents and has created a new way for these commercial companies to look at their logistics when it comes to downtown, and bringing in smaller vehicles, as well as creating mobile transit hubs where you have one large 18-wheeler that's going down a street and smaller trucks moving from that, delivering to other places. So we've seen some great outcomes from that.
Great. I know we're at time, so we'll go ahead and wrap. I just wanted to say thank you both so much. I know how busy you all are just delivering on your programs and doing all of the important behind the scenes work to make these things happen. So thanks for taking a break to share some of your kind of candid insights with us and kind of push us to think a little bit more holistically about the curb. Thank you.